The chess master recommends bishop takes knight. Your bishop captures knight, which partially pins black's pawn at g7, forks black's pawn at e5, and black's queen, and blocks black's pawn at f7. Black responds with pawn captures bishop, which protects black's queen and black's pawn at e5. You move your queen to f3. Black counters by moving the rook to g8. You move your knight to e2, which makes way for a castle to the king side. Black counters by moving the pawn to d5, which threatens your bishop. Your pawn takes pawn, which protects your bishop. Black responds by moving the bishop to g4, which attacks your queen. You move your queen to e4, which moves it to safety and blocks black's pawn at e5. Black responds with the queen to b6, which threatens your pawn at b2. You move your bishop to b3, which removes the threat on your pawn at b2. Black counters by moving the bishop to b4, which checks your king. You move your knight at b1 to c3, which protects your king. Black responds with knight to d7, which clears the way for a queenside castle. Your pawn takes pawn, which attacks black's knight. Black counters with pawn takes pawn, which removes the threat on black's knight. As a result of this line of play, you win a knight and 2 pawns for a bishop and a pawn. In addition, black's pawn structure is destroyed. The chess master recommends knight to e2. You move your knight to e2. Black counters with the bishop to b6. You move your pawn to a4. Black answers with pawn at b5, captures pawn. Your rook takes pawn, which blocks black's pawn at a5. Black responds by moving knight to d7, which moves it off the edge. You move your queen to c3, which attacks black's pawn at c6. Black replies by moving rook at h8 to c8, which removes the threat on black's pawn at c6. You move your rook to d1. Black responds by moving the king to f7. You move your pawn to b4. Black answers with pawn at a5, takes pawn, which forks your rook at a4 and your queen. Your rook captures rook, which attacks black's rook at c8. Black answers with rook takes rook. Your queen captures pawn at c6, which forks black's knight and black's rook and isolates black's pawn at b4. As a result of this sequence of moves, you win a rook and 2 pawns for a rook and 2 pawns. Additionally, the mobility of your pieces is enhanced. Also, black's pawn structure is somewhat weakened. Finally, the pressure on black's king is slightly increased. The chess master recommends rook to d1. You move your rook to d1, which partially pins black's pawn at d5. Black counters with the knight to e2. You move your rook at f1 to e1. Black answers with knight captures knight, which checks your king. You move your king to g2, which moves it out of check and attacks black's rook at h3. Black answers with knight to e2. Your king takes rook. Black replies by moving rook to h8, which skewers your king, removes the threat on black's knight, and checks your king. You move your king to g2, which moves it out of check and attacks black's knight. Black counters with rook takes knight, which removes the threat on black's knight and checks your king. You are forced to move your king to f1, which moves it out of check. Black counters with the knight to g3, which forks your king and your pawn at b2. You are forced to move your king to g1, which moves it out of check and attacks black's rook. Black answers with rook takes pawn, which isolates your pawn at a3 and your pawn at c3. Your pawn takes pawn, which isolates black's pawn at e6. Black counters with the bishop to b6, which checks your king. You move your rook to d4, which protects your king. Black responds with knight to e2, which forks your king and your pawn at c3. Your rook captures knight, which removes the threat on your pawn at c3 and your king and threatens black's rook. Black answers with bishop captures rook, which removes the threat on black's rook and triple forks your pawn at d5, your king and your pawn at c3. You move your king to f1, which moves it out of check, removes the threat on your rook, and attacks black's rook. Black responds with rook takes rook. Your king takes rook. Black answers with bishop takes pawn, which isolates your pawn at d5. Your pawn takes pawn at c6, which checks black's king and creates a passed pawn on c6. Black responds with king captures pawn. As a result of this line of play, black's attack potential is decreased. Additionally, black's pawn formation is disrupted. Also, the pressure on your king is slightly decreased. However, it is not possible to escape the loss of 2 rooks, 2 knights, and 3 pawns. For 2 rooks, a knight, and 2 pawns,